Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Good evening. It's great to see everyone here. I'm Rakesh Khurana, and I am really delighted to have a chance to moderate this discussion. And in particular, I think really model what is the best about what liberal arts and sciences education is, which is the capacity to engage in deep discussion around challenging issues in which people don't necessarily have agreement, but show how we can disagree without being disagreeable. I'm really excited to have a chance to learn from both of our discussants. And in particular, I think it's just as a moderator, I should just let you know, so I was not raised in the Christian faith. My parents were sort of raised us as Hindus, but not very observantly. I'm what Max Weber might call religiously unmusical. I just want to sort of put that out there so that as I moderate, I'm able to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. Let me set the context for the topic for the American dream. It's a very complicated idea. It's in fact rooted in a complex set of ideas that touch on sociology, political science, economics. Many people associate it with the founding of this country. Robert Bellah, who is a sociologist of religion, actually shortly before he passed away 2 years ago, gave the last Tanner lectures here at Harvard, was probably the best student about the American dream, really trying to devote most of his 50-year career as a sociologist to understand it, what it meant. He often talked about the American dream as actually being rooted in 4 different ideas. One idea rooted in the private sphere, in which the idea of the American dream was that it was largely the idea that you could be left alone. It goes back to the Pilgrims who came to this country. It was the right to sort of be connected to one's own concerns, goals that you have set for yourself, the notions of being left alone to pursue them. But as Bellah points out, after that the question is, but toward what ends? After you're left alone to pursue those things, for what purpose? And he said that was one of the problems with this private sphere idea. He then connected it to another element of the American dream, also again rooted with those same founders, basically the public idea of the American dream, which is rooted in the inherited conventions of your community, your family, an allegiance to those traditions, a respect for what came before. And in particular, again, we often see this idea in institutions where the church, which was an important part of the founding of this country. But then the question is, but what about people who don't share those communities, who come from different traditions? How do they fit into the picture, Bellah argued, is the question that you're left with that aspect of the American dream. The third part is breaking free from norms and conventions. In fact, the idea is that you get to decide for yourself. And in fact, much of what we often talk about in terms of liberal arts and sciences education is the capacity to critically engage on norms and traditions and those taken for granted aspects. But then he said the question is, well, what do you do after you're liberated? Freedom is a great horse to ride, but where do you ride it? And the fourth one is yet another one rooted in the idea of a shining city on a hill, which is the idea of building a better world, a more just society, that one needs to get power in order to advance notions of fairness and equity. Each of these raise fundamental questions about the American dream. And in particular, I think this is an apt time to be talking about these questions because we are at a unique moment in American history. President Obama only a few months ago asked the question if the American dream was still alive. We're in a searching moment around that idea. He talked about the growth in inequality, which now exists at this country at levels that haven't been seen since the dawn of the industrial age. Others point to the fact that most of the polls that we now see believe that 3/4 of the country now believes the U.S. is headed in the wrong direction, while 60% of our political class believe we're headed in the right direction. CEO pay, which used to be 2-to-1 in 1960 from the ratio of the President of the United States to CEOs, is 62-to-1 today. So all of these questions, social mobility, which our own faculty have shown has slowed down considerably, institutions that we once counted on in terms of creating the social order in our society that made the American dream possible, businesses and corporations increasingly do things like tax inversions and saying they owe no loyalty to any institution or nation or people. So much of this is driven, I think, about active debates about the American dream, and I'm very excited to have two of our discussants who I think are very well versed in thinking deeply about not only the American tradition and what it means, but also approaching this from its moral components, a comparative component. So let's get started. I think you will find these two individuals incredibly inspiring, as I have just even with my short time with them at dinner tonight. So we'll start with Professor Michael Puett. Professor Puett comes from the East Coast, right here at Harvard. He teaches work on Chinese philosophy. He teaches one of the most popular classes. He has immersed himself in Far East thinking, in particular ancient Far East thinking, and I guess I would ask him the question, what does the idea of the American dream mean from the context of a comparative perspective like a Chinese philosophy? Would these ideas even resonate, or are they so unique to a Western Judeo-Christian tradition there? And one of the things I should just note, I've encouraged our discussants to really bring in their own personal narratives and their own stories in the process of our discussion. So, Professor Puett?
Great, thank you. Let me just begin by thanking the Veritas Forum for putting this together. It's a tremendous honor to be here. Wonderful to see you, Rakesh, and Charles. I very much look forward to this conversation. We did indeed have a wonderful dinner, and it's been wonderful talking with you, and I very much look forward to this conversation. So, Rakesh, let me indeed respond to your question immediately. Yeah, I would actually say the American dream is not something, I'll be speaking a few words from the Confucian tradition here, none of the American dream, as outlined by Rakesh, I think would be seen as antithetical to Confucian values. The concern, on the contrary, from a Confucian point of view, would have been the points you're making toward the end of your comments, which is, have those values, as wonderful as they sound in the abstract, are we living up to them? Or rather, have they become kind of absent categories that we repeat to ourselves while in fact falling into a very complacent way of living? Meanwhile, living in a society that is truly not living up to those ideals and not even questioning the degree to which we are failing. From a Confucian point of view, the immediate question would be, on a very daily basis, how do we live our lives? What are we doing when we live our lives? What kind of a society in practice are we slowly building? And I think the concern would be, from a Confucian perspective, quite a critical one, that the American dream is not something we're actively practicing, and basic values from a Confucian perspective of transforming oneself to build a better world around us, these values in practice, despite what we say, but in practice I think are not really being lived up to. And then the question from a Confucian perspective is, at a very, very practical level, what do we do? What do we do when we live our daily lives to live them better? What kind of institutions do we need to build at a very practical level that will help us live up to these ideals? How do we actually cease to live such a complacent life and actively do something better? And what in practice would that mean? So, thank you.
Great. So, Professor Lee, you hail from Stanford. You are a professor at the Graduate School of Business. Your background is as an economist. And in addition, you seem to have also had some experience in the financial industry, and in many ways very open about your faith and the role that that plays in your life. I guess I would ask the question in just building that, how does the idea of the American dream, I mean, in some ways you embody it. I heard your story a little bit before in terms of as an immigrant and coming to Canada and then to the United States. I mean, what does that mean to you in terms of American dream? And how do you reconcile it with where we are as a country right now?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for allowing a Stanford guy to come here and spend a little time with you. And I really enjoyed dinner, sincerely. And the topic itself is also obviously dear to my heart. I've been called a banana because I'm yellow outside but sort of white inside because I came when I was very little. And in that case, I think Michael over there is an egg, right? So he's. I think. So, Rakesh is stuck with a fruit basket here talking about the American dream. So we are, I think we agree that America has drawn a lot of our parents here because of not only the hope of a better life in terms of wealth, but also in terms of opportunities, in terms of fairness, and a lot of other things. I do think, and I agree with Michael, that there are a lot of things missing here. And the issue is, how do we get there? And in what framework can we think about what is not here that ought to be here? I think about when I think about this, what I think about is some sort of metaphysical commitment to a metaphysical worldview. It sort of informs everything we do. I was not born a Christian. I became a Christian when I was 24, and that had a huge impact on the way I think about life, and I think about what to do in terms of purpose and even who I am. So the way I think about this is a little bit like, I don't know, it's like music. Life is a little bit like a dance. We are all kind of dancing because we hear something in our head, like music. It's like someone bopping down the street. They have earplugs on. You can't hear what they're hearing, but they're responding to it. And life is like a dance. We're dancing at the edge of eternity. And our worldview, whether we acknowledge them or not, is like the music playing in our heads. And it's worthwhile to spend some time thinking about the kind of music that you're playing and why. And I'm a Christian. For me, becoming a Christian was a radical event. I wasn't looking to become a Christian. It just sort of happened to me. But after that, the music really changed. And I think that because of those beliefs, I hope that we have an opportunity to explore them as we think about in the context of the American dream. Yeah.
That's great. So if I could ask a follow-on on that question, I mean, you say that, we need some worldview. There's a kind of existential kind of need for meaning and purpose. As somebody who, I can understand how that might fit in your private life. So this kind of goes back perhaps to the idea of the American dream, which is, sure, go ahead, but don't share it with everybody. That's something you need to, that's really something in the realm of the private sphere. How do you think about that with respect to being an academic, a faculty member at a secular institution like Stanford? How do you think about that when, you were working in finance? Does it play a role in those places, or is it something that really does belong to the private sphere?
Oh, this is a great question. So I was very excited to be participating in Veritas because I really feel like these are things that we should be discussing. There's a tendency in campuses today to sort of teach technical, sectoral knowledge. We try to silo what we teach. It's a little bit, we sort of outsource our discussions about life and how to live a meaningful life because we're a little worried about it being a little bit too sensitive. And so, in my view, these are the more important questions. And we do need to ask, because life is more than about knowledge, it's about wisdom. And wisdom is the application of these technical knowledges in your day-to-day life. And I do wish that we could talk more about that, and I do think it's important. I think faith is private, but it is not only private. If it is an assertion about reality, then we should take it seriously. The reason we don't take it seriously is because we think it's preferences like cuisine, or it's preferences like, cultural. But if it is different claims on reality, we should talk about that.
Michael, you teach a class on Chinese philosophy. When I was becoming dean, one of the things that people kept talking about was your course. It wasn't intuitive to me that it would be a course that fills up this room every semester. Why do you think students are drawn to the course that you're teaching? Because many students, in fact, I have an Atlantic Monthly article titled, "Why Are Hundreds of Harvard Students Studying Ancient Chinese Philosophy?" And again, not totally intuitive, but one of the first few sentences in the article is that students describe it as a change your life kind of course. So what do you think is drawing students in? Is it the fact that there's kind of a vacuum or an absence of discussion about how should we live? What does it mean to lead a good life? Yeah. And the fact that we can't talk about it in certain ways, we have to find a way of doing it through calling it philosophy or calling it something else?
I think sadly that's very true. I think oddly, here we are at a university where we ought to be asking the big questions. Of course, we're talking to students at what often will be the crucial moment in their lives to really think through how to live their lives, what they want to do with their lives, how to begin constructing the sorts of lives that they will be living. And ironically, these big questions seem to have kind of fallen out of the discourse. Not that people don't ask them, but sadly they often aren't being asked in courses. And so the reason I teach the courses I do, it's on classical Chinese philosophy. We read only the philosophers themselves, no secondary literature. We simply read the text. These are not easy texts, but we read them. In translation, of course, but that is simply the focus of the course. And yeah, exactly. And so it's not in classical Chinese.
It's Gen Ed, what are you going to do? You have to translate it into English.
But that is the goal. And we read them, and I ask the students to take them seriously. And the reason we do this is these are texts that do pose these questions. They ask the big questions. How do I live a life? What are the implications of living a life this way or that way? And they will offer very practical suggestions. In other words, for these texts, the question is, at a day-to-day level, what do I do? And the argument is your life and all that you will do with it comes out of the day-to-day. So we read the texts, we debate what they argue. I don't ask the students to agree with any of the texts. In fact, they all disagree amongst themselves. They couldn't all agree with each of the arguments. But what I do ask them to do is to take the text seriously. Ask themselves week by week as we read each philosopher, what it would mean to really put this into practice. I've been asking students to, in fact, do so each week a little bit. I give them practical advice as to what it would mean to actually put this into practice, and in practice feel what it would be to live one's life this way. And the goal is indeed to begin that process of saying, how does one live one's life at a daily basis, even if one disagrees with all of these texts? The very fact of working through these texts over the course of a semester, I argue, absolutely will change one's life. The texts are that powerful. Agree with them or not, but they truly will change one's life if one takes them seriously.
That's great. I mean, we do talk often about, the mission of Harvard College to educate citizens and citizen leaders. It's supposed to be a transformative experience. Then why do so many, I can even tell you, so I'll speak for myself in my first person, I would be very reticent to talk about these questions in a classroom.
Yes.
And I think some of it goes back to knowing a little bit about the history of educational institutions that were often use things like religion or values or certain kinds of moral philosophies, not as a way of drawing people in, but rather as a way of keeping people out.
Yes.
And so I just wonder, how do you think about that and the kind of line that has to be managed in that way?
Yeah, great question. And I think one of the reasons these texts resonate so well is precisely because they don't offer answers to these and therefore don't exclude people. In other words, these texts will not say, X worldview is the correct one, and therefore, by implication, other worldviews are wrong. Rather, just to give an extreme example, Confucius, one of the great philosophers from early China, will openly say when his disciples ask him about the big metaphysical questions, his answer is consistently, I have absolutely no idea. Not to say they're not important, but to say, in practice, live your life. In practice, try to endlessly challenge yourself, break from the common patterns you fall into, and out of that transformational process, and think of your life as this precisely transformational process, you will make yourself into a completely different type of person. You will become the sort of person who can build an incomparably better world, and these big questions about what is out there, what is the truth, come out of that daily practical work. So these are texts that don't give immediate answers. They also don't give exclusionary answers. You can believe in any system and still put in practice these ideas. And I think they resonate with students precisely for that reason. They are very practical. They make no immediate metaphysical claims, even though they ultimately get there in terms of how we would live our lives. And therefore, they're not exclusionary. Anyone can actually, on their daily basis, put these ideas into practice.
So I think one difference, though, between Christianity and the Eastern kind of philosophy that Michael is talking about is that Christianity also asks the questions, but then it has the answers. And so how do you think about that? Because it's sort of a different kind of dialogue. Or maybe,
okay,
I want to make sure I'm not
this is very important.
mischaracterizing it.
So let me put that out, okay? I would say that there are all answers. Michael's answer is there is no answer, or that there is no point asking certain things. I think that's very consistent with Confucianism, because there are some axiomatic assumptions that began that's by saying this is life. The rest is not knowable, so let's optimize. I had believed something like that until I was 24. After I was 24, I believe a different reality. I believe that there is more than that. I believe there's evidence for why there's more than that. And if I believe it, and I take seriously that this is reality, then I cannot help but say that which I believe. And let me just observe also that every answer is exclusive if it is a serious claim about reality, including the fact that that there is nothing after death, which is an assertion. And I actually Confucius does not say that there is nothing more. He just says, I haven't met it yet.
Precisely.
So he says, what is it in Chinese? So if I see the Tao in the morning, I die a happy man at night. Chinese guys, help me out.
Yeah, exactly.
What is that in Chinese? You see, they know.
Wow.
朝闻道，夕死。夕死什么？慈禧而已。You know what that says?
No, I have no idea, actually. I grew up in Queens.
It's awesome. What he says is, if I encountered the way, you know, Tao means the great way, the divine way. If I encountered the way in the morning, I die a happy man at night.
Yes.
So he's not excluding the possibility. He's
Absolutely.
acknowledging the reality. He hasn't encountered it.
Absolutely.
And actually, that's exactly what I would have said about myself. But I had an experience that made me believe that there is more to it than that. And therefore, I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian not because of culture, but because of certain assertions about what happened in history that I take seriously.
If I may, just
Please.
respectfully just follow up. I think one of the aspects of perhaps being an academic is a skepticism always about one's claim to reality. There's always a confidence interval. There's the worry about making a type 1 error, which is accepting something as a truth when in fact it may not. I mean, and it's actually, it goes right to the scientific method. It's rooted in kind of Popper's ideas around everything is a question, and I don't want to deny your reality, but I guess one question with me is, how do you do that and leave room for other people to challenge your reality, or for you to engage with it in a more skeptical way?
Well, I think I'd welcome it. I think we should talk about how we make decisions under uncertainty. I think that the most interesting questions in life are made under uncertainty. So under certainty, we all do the same thing. So under uncertainty, we use weight of evidence. So I use weight of evidence when I make hard decisions, like, should I marry Lily, my wife? Lily, it wasn't very hard. So, in your case, but it was an under uncertainty type decision. I think that we make, in a relationship, in morality, in commitments to worldviews, we use weight of evidence. And I would say that I would invite people to discuss the weight of evidence, for example, for the resurrection of Jesus, for pieces of the faith that I take seriously. I really wish we could take it serious enough to actually discuss these things, because some people think that, you need a frontal lobotomy to become a Christian. Well, maybe I have one. I don't know. I became an accountant. But I think, I do think that these are, we're talking about weight of evidence under uncertainty. And so I would invite that.
So I'm going to turn to you in one more second, but I'm just going to ask one more follow-up.
Yeah.
You're a behavioral economist.
I am.
You study, in fact, the realm between the psychological and the rational. And you just brought up the question about uncertainty. Does uncertainty ever confront you in ways of your everyday life that causes you to challenge some of those beliefs?
Yes. So here.
And can you give an example?
On a sunny day, I'm very grateful for the sun. On a cloudy day, I want to tell myself the sun is still there. And on cloudier days, it's harder to be as certain that the sun is still there. And during our human journey, there are many days when things seem cloudy. Faith is, in fact, making an assertion. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is a conviction of something that is unseen. So reality is that is part of it. But I would make the observation that all really important worldviews require you to take a faith stance. So, in other words, we're all hearing music. Okay, you might as well think about what music you are hearing, because you're dancing to it. Okay, and so I happen to be. I think Christianity is very specific about the tune. I think that other faith may be also very specific, but we should talk about where those specificities differ.
So, Michael, let me just turn to that and pick up on, Charles's assertion about, Christianity as a worldview. And I know you see traditional religious beliefs as an important lens through understanding humanity, that it is an important part of understanding history and understanding the human condition. But does this ultimately boil down to you for a relativist position that, there's a lot of different ways of accessing reality? Or is it okay to say that, Charles is entitled to his reality, but I have a different one? Or do we have a third thing that, again, for somebody who may even be further distances, well, let's do an empirical examination or a horse race about which one could be more true? How do you think about this?
Yeah, and it's a wonderful question, and I would characteristically think of it very much from a Confucian point of view in this case. And not surprisingly, and the way Confucius would put it is very intriguing. He would argue that one of our dangers as human beings is we tend to fall into sort of patterns of behavior that we just endlessly repeat, and that we actually live our lives very differently from what we often claim we're doing. So we may have great ideals that we think we're living by, but in practice we're just sort of playing out the same patterns over and over again. And what interests him is therefore to that we self-consciously do things to break us out of that. So he's, for example, very interested in rituals, but rituals in a very specific sense. So rituals in which you create these spaces in which you have to become a very different type of person to break you out of your standard ways of acting. And the argument isn't that the way you act in these rituals is necessarily better. He's really interested in that break, like breaking from your patterns, seeing the world from a different way, and therefore in practice beginning to live your life in a more effective way, and then think of your life as doing this constantly. Now, this may seem like a really bizarre way to answer your question, but the reason I begin this way is to say what he would care about, and I would very much agree with him on this case, is that's really what matters. In other words, if he's right, and I think empirically he is, that this is one of our dangers as human beings, what we need are these breaks, things that break us out of these ruts, that break us out of these ruts, help us to see the world in better ways, help us to transform our lives such that we are living them in more effective ways and ways that help others for the better. What those breaks will be for us will indeed vary dramatically. Absolutely, religions can and have been incredibly important in doing these. But of course, from a Confucian point of view, since there's no pre-commitment to what is ultimately correct, the argument isn't, well, should I argue this worldview is correct and this one is wrong? Again, he would be completely agnostic about that. He would say, if things you do force that break in a good way, continue doing them. And so I think hearing exactly what Charles, what you've been saying, I think this is wonderful. Like, clearly your faith is creating those breaks that are allowing you to live your life incredibly effectively. From a Confucian point of view, even without a pre-commitment to saying that worldview is correct, the argument would be wonderful. In other words, it's clearly helping you to live your life incredibly effectively, and as long as that is what religion is doing, which is what religion does at its best, it is wonderful. So getting back to your question, the claim would not be, should we choose which worldview is correct? The argument is, if you have a worldview that creates a complacent world that we just take for granted, that doesn't break us out of our standard patterns, that becomes just sort of things we say but don't really put into practice, that's the danger. If, on the contrary, you're doing things, what Confucius would call ritual, that break us, that help us transform, that help us become better human beings, that's what we're looking for. And so you're not looking for the content of the claim so much, although that's important, but what really matters is, are we doing things that allow us to live our lives effectively? And religion can be an incredibly important way to do so.
Great. Can I ask a follow-on on that? So if I hear you correctly, and I want to make sure I'm not mischaracterizing what I've heard, which is that, you know, what Confucianism is asking is make sure you don't fall into those taken for granted patterns where you can't even see the assumptions anymore that sort of are guiding your behavior and actions. Those things that can break frame for us are valuable, whatever happens to be those interventions.
Precisely.
As somebody who's been here for many years at Harvard and as a faculty member, and who's beloved by our students, and beloved by our community, and what are the taken for granted patterns that you see in places like selective institutions like Harvard and Stanford? And what would be the kinds of breaks that you would, frame breaks, that you would like to see our community more often engage in? And just want to ask you that as an observer of our community.
Absolutely. I think we have, I'm sorry to say, fallen into these, and I say that not to be overly critical, because every community would tend to, but it's important to always be self-critical of them. And I think we fall into several of these. One very obvious one that's been a common topic of discussion, but it deserves to be on the table, is a very dangerous vision of individual success defined in very narrow ways that I think is incredibly limiting toward what we can do as human beings, and often self-defeating in terms of what we actually can accomplish and in terms of our hopes and our hopes of building a better society. I would even give a less obvious one, which is when we often think, well, I don't want to be on the easy path towards success, I want to make something more of my life. Often we will use a rhetoric which sounds great in the abstract, but Confucius would say, look and practice at what it means. We'll say things like, I want to find my true self. I want to be sincere to my authentic self. I want to find myself and live my life authentically according to my own values. Now, in the abstract, this sounds great. But the question would be, in practice, is there a danger that if you simply are looking within and saying, I'll be true to my authentic self that I'm finding within, the danger is that what you're finding within is simply some of these patterns, these ruts that you've fallen into. And so when we say things like, I'm just the sort of person who is good at the following, and I'm just sort of the person who is not so good at the following. And when I think of my career goals, I should find a career out there that will fit in well with what I am like as a person and what the range of practical possibilities are in society where I can fit given who I am. And immediately from a Confucian perspective, you'd want to say, well, why do you define what you are based upon what you are finding right now? Maybe it is just these sets of patterns. And maybe on the contrary, think of your life on the contrary as becoming something that you could not yet even imagine. And what that would mean is, at a very practical daily level, putting in practice these things that break you from these standard patterns, allowing yourself to grow, actively growing as a human being, actively trying to become a better human being, and actively working to spend one's life transforming oneself in ways that, again, you could not even imagine. And getting back to your immediate question, I would say that's one of the dangers I think we're falling into, is by emphasizing these terms, success, find yourself and therefore become successful by finding the good occupation that fits what you are as a human being. All of that sounds great, but what we're not therefore doing is really challenging ourselves to grow as human beings. Ironically, despite this great terminology, what we're really doing is restricting ourselves dramatically. And I think as an institution devoted to helping, I would hope, helping people become great human beings, I worry that we're falling into a terminology, a way of practices that ironically are restricting our students rather than helping them open up.
Let me respond to that. Okay, so we're talking about success, right? So what is success? I mean, how do we define success? I mean, is success a good thing? How many of you don't want to be successful? Just raise your hand. How many of you don't want? So we all want to be successful, right? But what about being a successful liar, a successful thief, a successful terrorist? Right? Success is simply the attainment of a goal. What's more important than success is the worthiness of that goal. And again, we go back to the need for a framework for thinking about what goal we are really aiming for. I mean, the success of a knife is to cut because it was designed to cut. The success of a racehorse is to run because it was bred to run. So what is the success of a human being? It depends on what you think a human being is. So again, we're back to the music in your ears. It goes back to the same questions that the security guard asked you at night when you're wandering around campus. Who are you? What are you doing here? Where are you going? What are you up to? These are sensible questions. I feel, it's a little harder for me to work that stuff into my lecture notes when I'm teaching debits and credits. But I do feel those are the more important questions that we should be discussing. If they were all exactly the same, if all of the worldviews are giving you the same answers, then it does not matter. Go for it. If there are different answers, you should at least take it seriously enough to recognize where the differences are. If it is really important, and if these are claims on reality and not preferences or desires or tastes, then we should be talking about what the difference is. There's a very good, can I do advertisement for another Ivy League university? Yeah. There is
all one big community.
All right. So,
there are other Ivy League universities?
So now I know I am at Harvard. No, okay. So actually, this is one of the most humble men I've ever met. So Confucius says, 三人行必有我师, right? If three walk together, there is my teacher. And this man is a walking embodiment of that. So
all three, by definition, would be my teachers. By definition, I would be the very bad disciple.
Yeah. So we agree too much. You're not going to have a fun if we agree too much. So
I know I'm the one who's disagreeing with both of them, and I'm supposed to be the neutral moderator, so.
So there is a wonderful professor by the name of Miroslav Volk at Yale. He teaches a class called The Life Worth Living, and it is a serious reflection about what the various claims are of some major faith systems, Christianity, Buddhism, and number 5 of them, I think. And what is interesting is that it's not, I think it's just the way Michael teaches his class, it is not just introducing you to these ideas, but it is asking you, what would then that require of you? In other words, if that were true, how would your life change? These are reasonable questions. So for example, I'm not doing him justice, but there's like 5 questions that would be asked of every one of these things. Like, what is the claim? What's available to you through this claim to achieve these claims? For example, and what happens if you fail in this worldview? And let's see, there was something else. So the basic idea is we take seriously our worldviews. And even if you say, my default view is I don't know, that is a worldview. You still have to dance to that music. And I think that it's worthwhile for us to talk about those things. I am a Christian. I believe certain things about history that some people might think is a little crazy, but I would love to talk about that because, yeah.
But let me just inquire on that a little bit more. One is the work that it takes to answer those questions. By the way, what you described as the kind of prescription seems like a lot of work. Like to keep asking yourself these questions, to keep doing the taken for grantedness.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's easier that there's some pretty well-paved roads that might exist because somebody who was smarter than you already answered these questions and the roads have been pretty well paved and you just sort of go along in default mode. Nice. But maybe default mode is totally fine. Why do I have to be so agentic in this process? Why do I have to constantly be asking myself these questions? Why can't I just be busy, check off the boxes, do my duty, graduate from these institutions, get a job in my, whatever my sort of aspects of my personal life, take care of the people, and say, that's all that was necessary. I didn't have to sort of spend all my time on this examined life. Why is that? Why is that important? I mean,
Keith, you're supposed to be helping us.
No. I think I'm trying to channel a little bit, I think, maybe not the students who are here, but maybe the students who aren't here.
I see.
I mean, why should we spend so much time on that? Because it seems like it does require a type of rigor, and if the questions are not ultimately answered, is it that you just sort of feel like your life is well led for having asked them?
Oh, I think having asked them is an awfully important start. I think that not asking them, sometimes it may be because it doesn't seem important, doesn't end up as a line on your resume, but the teachings of the Bible repeatedly remind us that we are more than the sum of the atomic parts that make us up. There's something called a soul, a spirit, and the wellness of the soul is far more important than the abundance of your wealth. If you were to summarize the teachings on wealth and on money that in the Bible, that would be it.
But some might argue that, so you teach in a business school, I teach in a business school, we are at selective institutions that in which success is often, we're naming our buildings often people who conform to a certain definition of success. We don't name them after people who ask questions all the time. I really want to interrogate this a little bit because, and I'm taking a little bit more of an extreme view than, reality. But I do think, because there's a lot of different mixed signals that you get. You're offering one view, but I think there's a lot of different signals that all of us get about what success means, what it means to lead a good life here,
Yes.
what's rewarded, what you can tell your parents about, what you can tell your friends about. When you show up at 50th year reunion, 10th year reunion, 25th reunion, what is it, the things that people say, oh, that's great, or, oh, that's great.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how should we think about these things?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that we will, of course, hear very, very different views, particularly, I'm sorry to say, in our current environment, that will define success in a very clear way, with a very clear defined path, with the sense that if you follow this path, of course, you will be successful in a very clear way, and you may get a building named after you, and it's a very doable thing. I would raise several questions. Not only about the likelihood that will succeed, although that's an obvious question, but I would even say much more importantly, is the way that we're defining success making it very unlikely you'll even reach that specific goal of success before we even get to the issues Charles was very accurately raising about whether those would even be good goals. And if, on the contrary, you see the world as one in which there aren't good predefined paths, I mean, there's certainly predefined paths that society is giving us, but assume that those are potentially ruts, patterns, easy ways that probably are going to be self-defeating. If you assume that, then yes, it is in a sense a life of work, but it's good work. And what I mean by that is the following. Just give two quick examples of places in our lives where we do the sorts of things that Confucius was talking about. And they're two very easy ones. Think of learning a musical instrument. That's lots of work, right? You spend lots of time, if you're learning a piano, doing rote drills for years, and it's a lot of work. But what you gain by those years is, over time, an ability to sense the instrument, to sense the music, to be able to play music in a way that goes beyond simply those rote patterns, where you can sense a situation, play the music slightly differently, alter the mood of a room by the way you play, and the work is unbelievably fulfilling in terms of what you can become through that work. Another obvious example, sports. Again, learning basketball. How many hours do you spend throwing that basketball into that little net? But then, if you spend enough time doing it, what you then become is the team player, where you can sense movement around the team, of the players. You can sense just how quickly and tightly to throw a ball, sensing the entire mood of the court perfectly. It's this incredibly opening sensibility you gain through all of that work. Now, if you think of your life this way, what it would mean is, yes, you're in part at the beginning doing lots of work in terms of the equivalent of doing these rote drills when you're learning a piano, or doing these drills when you're throwing a basketball at a net. But over time, what allows you to do, if you're training your life this way, to sense people better, to work on yourself, transform yourself so that you're more open to the world and sensing the world better and acting in ways that can create a better world around you, what you can gain out of that is extraordinary. You gain this kind of, Confucius will even talk about the kind of joy that comes out of building a better world around you. And that is extraordinary success. People who do this will become unbelievably successful, but again, in ways they couldn't have predefined when they were young and beginning it. They can become successful in ways that are truly impossible to imagine, because you become a different type of person, a much better person, by doing this. So yes, it's work, but boy, is it great work. And you feel the joy as you're doing it when you're living your life well with other human beings.
Can you describe a moment in your life in which you felt this transcendent feeling about that joy, that music, or that awe about being part of something bigger than yourself?
Yes, and tellingly, again from the Confucian perspective, this is very, very telling. For Confucius, the transcendent joy you gain comes out of the common and the mundane and the everyday. And the answer to your question is yes. Reading these texts and beginning to try to live my life this way, you begin to feel precisely that transcendent just joy of connecting with others, but it's in the here and now. It's in your daily life. You're just connecting with people well, sensing people well, indeed learning from everyone you meet. And it truly is transcendent. It's absolutely transforming. You are constantly breaking from your patterns. You're feeling the kind of transcendence that you're talking about, but you're feeling it not just at certain moments in a life, you're feeling it in your daily life, in your mundane life, as you begin to live differently. And absolutely, reading these texts have absolutely transformed me. I'm still a horrible person, but at least I'm a much, much, much better person than I was before I started reading these texts. Yes.
So Michael talks about this transcendence can come from a variety of places. Doing one's work well, the attention to detail, the patterns that one consciously engages in life, and the discipline that comes from that. You worked in business for a few years as a successful financial manager at Barclays, multi-billion-dollar funds. One caricature you sometimes hear about people who work in finance and stuff is that they're not finding transcendence, that's not the way the job is designed or worked, or that you can see the outcomes of what you do, that it's too abstract, it's dealing in symbols, and just how did you see that in your work, or do you only find that in your faith?
Well, I'd say, you were talking about finding the divine in the mundane, right? So we often think of certain activities as being more sacred, and some activities as more secular. If I manage money for a not-for-profit, would that be more sacred than if I manage money for other people? I think that the classification doesn't work that way. The Bible is all about what's going on in your heart while you're doing something. If I were preaching, is that a very sacred thing? If I was teaching, is it less sacred? I think that it certainly depends on my motives for doing what I am doing. And so there is really no, I remember I had a young professor write to me once. He said, "Professor Lee, I think you're a Christian and you're doing well in your research. Could you please help me understand the eternal significance of accounting research?"
That's a great question.
Okay, you're a PhD, you're a business school professor. You're supposed to help me. So no, but I think I totally understand. I felt what he felt. Okay, I understand, because he was looking for purpose and meaning in things that are seemingly insignificant. And so I wrote him back. I said, "Dear so-and-so, do you know Brother Lawrence?" Brother Lawrence is a monk in the medieval times. He wrote a book called The Practice of the Presence of God. He lived in such a way that, everyone was aware that he lived in the presence of God. But Brother Lawrence was a cook. Right? So I emailed him. I said, "What is the eternal significance of an omelet?" And I named my daughter Monica after the mother of St. Augustine. As far as I know, she brought this hellraiser into the world, and she prayed for him. And one day he became one of the most influential theologians we've ever had. And so that's all that we've known her to have done. So what is the eternal significance of changing diapers? So much of what we do derives from why we do it, and in my case, I believe I'm a creature. In which case, success is defined in terms of my relationship with God, and I believe God has done things that have imposed obligations on me. For example, the uniqueness of Christianity really revolves around the personhood and the love of God. If you have been so loved, then you live accordingly. It isn't looking for transcendence moments in my case, although I totally relate to, moments where there is incredible joy in doing something simple. But it isn't a matter of looking for a transcendent moment. Somebody asked me, what is the difference between going to a Dale Carnegie course and coming to your fellowship, your church? I mean, you know, how to, what is that? How to make friends and influence people. So there is a huge difference. There's a difference between life enhancement and life transformation. And what Jesus said was, you know, there is something very fundamentally wrong inside. There is a breach. And there is a reason why you feel a gap between your moral aspirations and your moral conduct. You need to do something about it. You can't just fix your way out of it. You need to just look it square in the eye and acknowledge it. And my life change occurred when I did that. So there you go.
That's great. Let me turn the subject a little bit and kind of take it back to where we started, a little bit about when we were talking about the patterns of institutions, educational institutions, why were so many students drawn to courses like yours? What is the absence of sort of discussion of morality and values and the sources of those in contemporary institutions like ours? So Robert Bellah, who I referred to earlier, describes in a book that one of the things that we often hang our hat on in educations like ours is the capacity for critical thinking. It's the ability to just sort of critique. Whatever it is, find the flaw in the argument, the breakdown in the logic, suggest an empirical test, find the autocorrelation, the endogeneity, whatever it is that somehow denies you your assertion. And he quotes, this book was written in 1993, a undergraduate oration at a college, a selective institution like ours. It was ours. So this is what the student said. Among my classmates, however, I believe that there is one idea, one sentiment which we have all acquired at some point in our Harvard careers. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is, in a word, confusion. The graduate student orator the same year said, quote, "They tell us that it is heresy to suggest the superiority of some value, fantasy to believe in moral argument, slavery to submit to a judgment sounder than your own. The freedom of our day is the freedom to devote ourselves to any values we please, on the mere condition that we do not believe them to be true." End quote. The argument, he says, that's what education contemporarily does. It makes us incredibly critical, even including about our own perspectives. And I was wondering if you thought how useful that kind of education is, or does it need to go someplace further?
I think it's very true, your characterization. And
it wasn't my characterization,
Robert
Bellah.
But you're right to quote it. I think this has become very typical. I think we've gotten incredibly good at teaching our students, and the students have gotten incredibly good at inculcating these values of critically questioning everything, which is in itself, of course, a wonderful thing. But again, from a Confucian perspective, you'd always want to ask the question, what are the implications of the way we're doing this? And if it sounds good to always question, which I certainly think it is, in practice, if that's all we're doing, what happens? And indeed, as Bella's quotation accurately shows, what we're doing is creating a world in which we're questioning everything, but we're deconstructing all of our values and holding, in fact, even taking for granted that any value out there we should simply criticize and not hold as being of any particular validity, precisely because to be a proper critical thinker, we only question. And indeed, from a Confucian perspective, the question would be immediately, what does that actually mean in practice? And of course, what it means in practice is very clear. If you're denying all values, then you simply end up, again, playing out the standard old patterns of your life because you're not being challenged by anything else. And ironically, critical thinking actually, therefore, leads to non-critical living, simply repeating the same old patterns and not challenging yourself. So indeed, I think the key is, can we have a critical thinking that would, of course, question the patterns we're living, but then help us to propel ourselves into new and unforeseeable directions? And that, I think, is precisely the goal of education, and I'm sad to say I think it's a goal of education that we are not fully living up to.
As we just continue this conversation, please send your questions, because we'll start addressing those just momentarily. Do you want to respond to that aspects of what you think is missing in the education when it's just about critical thinking?
Yeah, we send a letter to our PhD students called, an article to the PhD students that I did in the past called, "Are We Training Pit Bulls?" And so the basic idea is that we get really good at training people who chew other people up. But it's not that defines, in the end, your human journey. It's what you buy. It's not what you decide not to buy. And it is good to look carefully when you buy. In fact, it's extremely important. But at the end of the day, you got to take some groceries home. You got to eat. And you have to be able to justify why you do what you do. And I just remember now, Professor Volk's 5 things that he asks of every worldview. And the last question he would ask a student is, in this worldview, who holds you accountable? I think that we can talk in the abstract about a lot of things. But at the end of the day, how are you living? Does it conform to your worldview? And who holds you accountable? Those are reasonable questions.
Great. So I think we have some questions. I can't see very well from here, so do you want to?
Thank you, Professors Puett and Lee, for starting off the conversation about... Yeah. And for Dean Karana for starting the conversation about what goals are motivating our success and what music we're hearing. At this time, we'll be transitioning to the Q&A, and I believe we'll have questions read off from the text that you guys have been sending in.
Okay, so the first question is, can you each summarize in 3 sentences what you fundamentally believe?
Wow.
Sure.
I point. It's a great thing about being moderator.
I fundamentally believe that we all have the potentials to be something far greater than we tend to live our lives to become, that we should therefore devote our lives to trying to become something far greater than we can imagine, and that work begins at a very daily, practical level, and from there will hopefully lead to our living extraordinary lives in which we can create a better world for ourselves and create a better world for those to come.
Oh, that's fantastic. Excellent.
I believe Jesus of Nazareth is God coming in flesh. I believe that he really lived, that he said the things that he said, and I believe that he died and he was resurrected. And I believe that if you really believe that, the direct implications of that will inspire you to not only live differently within your own life, but you will see every one of your relationships change. Christianity is all about, too many sentences, right? So the rest follows.
Thank you. So the next question?
Yes. Professor Lee, you mentioned that it's worthwhile to talk about our worldviews. This question is for both speakers. Do you think colleges should be doing more to graduate students who are literate in worldviews and philosophies and have the skills to engage in conversations like tonight's?
Am I allowed just to say yes?
Yes. Well, maybe just, why are we hesitant to?
Yeah.
Because professors like to profess, but it seems to be about certain subjects they don't want to.
Yes, I think we have become so tiptoesy about things like that we think are sensitive. We think that certain things will offend people, but I think that it's if we cannot at schools like ours model for the world how to agreeably disagree and to take seriously these questions that are difficult, then I don't know why we are here.
I think it's a really important question because I would like to ask a little bit, because when you think about the two, this is again oversimplifying things, but when you think about the two, at least I see two major forces shaping world dynamics today. Engaging them critically and in public is very challenging. So one is kind of the neoliberal model of capitalism, and the second is religion. These two forces right now are just, when you look around, they're reordering political systems, reordering the way people think about how they participate in public life. They're reordering, even in our own nation, our capacities to bridge or not bridge across divides. And yet, if they're, part of the reason is that we don't have the capacities to discuss these things, what the skills are. What are the capacities that we need in order to discuss such difficult, sensitive subjects that often go to the core of one's own identity and one's sense of self?
Yes. Yeah, it's both a wonderful question and a wonderful follow-up. And I, too, will answer immediately yes. And then in terms of the implications of all of this, I think that's exactly right. I think on the one hand, we have neoliberalism truly reorganizing the entire world, and sadly, that ceased to become even a significant topic of debate. In many classes, that's just presented as proper, for example, proper economics, that's the way the economic world should and does operate, and it's not debated. And then on the other hand, you have another force, religion, and yet that, ironically, certainly is a topic of debate, but not in forms like this, because oftentimes it's a topic of debate at universities in which each group will talk amongst themselves, but you're not getting real dialogue going on. And particularly, you're not getting real dialogue with the entire issue of, for example, neoliberalism. So yes, what we desperately need are more forums like this, where everything is on the table, where we can actually ask the big questions. We can ask, in terms of neoliberalism, are we building a type of good society? We've now been living in a neoliberal world since roughly 1980s, 1990s, depending on how one defines it. It has created all sorts of implications. Let's debate those. Let us debate the type of world we're creating. And if there are good things, how can we build on those? If there are dangerous things, and clearly there are, how do we work against those? And in terms of religion, clearly, what values should we be having? And could we actually bring those values into play in our discussions of what type of a society to build? And can we create spaces, and where better than a university, by all means, in which we can truly debate values and truly open up our students to really thinking in a concrete way through how do I live my life? What type of a society do I build? What are the implications of having certain types of values? How does one put those into play? And if we are failing as a university, and I mean not just here, but in general, to create a space in which those are active topics of debate, and I think we need to be honest that we are in part failing, then we actively need to start creating a shift where precisely these issues, values, building a good society, how to live a flourishing life, are at the center of our discussions in forums like this, in the classrooms, etc.
Great, thank you. The next question?
Can you be a Christian and still pursue the American dream?
Let's hear from the Canadian.
That's right, objective view here. Gosh, I have to figure out what the American dream is here. So here's what I think, okay? If you want to, we often think of the American dream as a bundle of things, doing well, being successful, becoming first immigrant, and then, becoming dean of Harvard or something like this. But I think that, in a sense, you should dream a little bigger, okay? I think that what as a Christian I found was the difficulty is not that I can that I could be successful or not successful. I think the difference, the important thing is what are the priorities in my life. If my priorities are right, then Christianity is not about poverty. Okay, the Bible doesn't say that poverty is in itself a virtue or that wealth is in itself a vice. But think of all of these things as ultimately not important. In other words, your worldly currencies, your money, your bitcoins, they're all zeros. Okay, Bitcoin's a little more zero than money. But your Alibaba IPOs, they're all zeros. Even your other endowments, your degree, many other things, they are in the grand and eternal scheme of things zeros. Okay? But as a Christian, if you have your priorities, right? If you put God first, then all these zeros become significant digits. Okay? So, in my view, it isn't about pursuing material things. But I want to also summarize my elevator pitch for the Bible summary on money is what it is not. Okay, so 1 in every 10 verses in the Gospels is about money. 16 out of 38 of the stories Jesus told is about money. Why is it so important that he keeps talking about this? Because we get confused. We start thinking that the American dream is in itself somehow fulfillment of God's calling on our lives. We get confused. All of these things in the Bible talks about is what money is not. Okay, it is not yours. It belongs to God. We are just stewards. These are like library books. They'll go back to you, to Him. It is not. It is not reliable. So, as a source of security, it's not reliable. Finally, it's not you. This is the most important thing. That we start to lose sight of something much more important. I think that's why Jesus is, don't worry about what you eat or what you wear. It's not that those things aren't important. He is saying, there's something else you need to feed. You need to feed your soul. You need to get your priorities right.
Do you have any?
I would say in terms of the American dream, if we think of the American dream in terms of pre-given answers, in other words, a pre-given definition of what we are as individuals, a pre-given vision of what success would mean, a pre-given vision of what America stands for. If we think of it that way, it will tend to lead us into very dangerous and complacent ways of thinking and being in the world. If, on the contrary, we think of the American dream as sets of challenges, how do we create a great society? How do we work to be great individuals with a very open-ended sense as to what that would even mean? How do we work to help each new generation think through what it would mean to be successful, both for themselves and in building a better world? If we think of the American dream as sets of challenges, then I think it's wonderful. And from a Confucian perspective, I think there would be no problem with that. So the key would be, what do we mean by an American dream? Are we using it in a complacent sense, those sets of terms, or in a way that would challenge us? Challenge us to be better human beings.
Great, thank you.
So,
do you want to respond to
yeah.
the question?
So let me make this observation about a harmonious or a good society. And I think those are the noble goals that we all want to accomplish. What I find really worth thinking about is why we are not there. If we can articulate this vision, Confucius articulated this 500 years BC, 大道之行，天下为公，选贤举， right? He had this gorgeous description of what the harmonious society looked like. There is no lack of moral and ethical clarity in terms of what it should be. That was 2,500 years ago. The question is, why aren't we there? The bigger question is not that we should see where we're going, because every culture has recognized what harmonious society looks like. What is it about us that made it so difficult? Why is it difficult to trust your fellow man or woman? Why is it that we need all this contract law? Why is it that we have to sort through all these difficulties? This is very important. This is actually key. This is actually the key to all of social science, because the difference between social science and physical science is what you have to assume about the nature of man. If you assume wrong thing about the nature of man, you're not going to get to where you want to go. Communism is, in some sense, a much better ideal. You live for the common good. But capitalism has worked. Many experts. Why? Because the assumption of the nature of man is a little more realistic in capitalism. It is harnessing it rather than essentially assuming it away. So when you think about these things, it comes right down to who is it that we are? And I find that the most satisfying answer is actually the description in Genesis 3 of who we are. We are a little bit lost without God. And instead of being a God-centered being, we became a self-centered being. And this self-centered being has a lot of problems. Something about self-esteem, something about how he or she interacts with other people, and certainly something about being able to talk to God.
Great, thank you. The next question.
As a follow-up to Professor Puett's observation that a Confucian perspective allows for the coexistence of different religious beliefs as long as they help us to live more effectively, what happens if those religious beliefs, particularly beliefs in a higher power, conflict in terms of how they define living effectively? Would certain beliefs then be invalid, and how would we decide?
Great question.
That's a
great question. And the answer is what Confucius will do is talk not in terms of belief and faith. He will talk in terms of, well, the term he will use is ritual, but what he means by this is ritual in the sense of doing things that break us from our way of being. So a very concrete example. In his own day, one of the standard forms of religious practice involved sacrificing to one's ancestors. And one of his disciples said, well, do you do this? I mean, is this something we should do? And his answer is, well, yeah, you absolutely do it, but you do it as if those ancestors are really there. It doesn't matter if they are or not. They may be there, they may not be there, but do it as if they're there because you're doing it to develop better sides of yourself. You're doing it to enter that ritual space, develop better sides, connecting with and understanding that you came from those who brought you forth, that you're connected to the past and you have to work with the past. And in that ritual space, you're acting as if they're there and working on it. Now, that may seem like a ludicrous way to answer your question, but the reason I preface it this way is this is his view in general about religious beliefs. He's not saying, think of whether this belief is correct or not, whether the faith in X is right or not. He is saying, put it into practice in this as-if context. And put that way, in answer to your question, it would come down in practice, not to the content of the belief in question. In other words, the question is not, is this religious belief correct? In which case, by definition, this religious belief would not be. It would be saying, create these as-if worlds in which you're living these values in an as-if space and transforming thereby. And therefore, what you're interested in is not, is the content of this religious belief correct, and therefore that one isn't. It's, in practice, are these as-if worlds helping us become a better human being? And what you'd find, I think, with any religious tradition is, in part, the answer is going to be yes, if you're putting part of these into practice. And I think in part, certain ways that they've been put into practice are very dangerous. And Confucius's hope is if you're thinking of them this way, you in practice begin to gain a sense of that. And so it's not making a claim as to ultimately, is this religion correct or that religion not correct? It's saying, in practice, if you're creating these as-if worlds, are they helping you to grow as a human being? And I think almost any religious tradition, the answer to that could be yes, but therefore, by definition, it all comes down to how do we live our lives with these values? How do we help? Do we act in a way that they help us grow? Again, as we refer back to before, the way Charles is living his life, I think a Confucian hearing this would say, yes, that's extraordinary. I mean, it's quite apart from the content of whether this is right or that is right. In practice, is this world helping Charles to live a better life? The answer is obviously yes. So Confucianism wouldn't make a content decision as to which is ultimately right. It would say, can you employ these in ways that will help you grow to challenge us and our societies? And if the answer is yes, in practice, then it's working wonderfully. So great question.
Can I ask a follow on that? So as I mentioned earlier, I was raised as a Hindu, and I remember asking my mother when I was younger the difference between being a Hindu and a Christian.
Yeah.
And she would say, well, when we go to pray, we take off our shoes and cover our head, And when Christians go to pray, they keep their shoes on and take their covering off their hat.
Yes.
She says, so it's the same thing. She says, like, it's just a different way of honoring. This is the one where you're taking it,
absolutely.
that it's a ritual.
Exactly.
But what happens when that ritual actually has meaning to your identity?
Yes.
That where it's not just the content or the symbolism or the kind of Durkheimian interpretation that you're giving, that, the content is sort of representing the same idea in different ways. But when the taking off the shoes or the covering of the hat or whatever, the head or whatever it is, actually has meaning to who you are and how you define yourself in life. Can you still reconcile when those things come into conflict or challenge?
The answer is yes from a Confucian perspective. And going back to your example of this is a very Durkheimian, the Confucian way is a very Durkheimian way of thinking, in part it's not. So quickly, what Durkheim would say is that basically rituals function to bring us into a larger social whole. And Confucius would say to that, I mean, maybe ultimately they do, but actually what they really do if they're working effectively is they actually function because they break you from their standard patterns of thinking. And that's what really matters. And therefore, if they work too effectively to bring you into something too seamlessly, they're actually not working. You want that break. Now, again, an absurd way it may sound like to answer your question, but the reason I emphasize it is to say, therefore, if in this ritual behavior, you're undertaking rituals that are deeply meaningful to you in terms of your identity, that wouldn't be the concern. The only concern would be don't become too complacent in that identity. In other words, allow that identity to always be something you're endlessly working on. So whether you're taking off your shoes or doing another ritual, don't think, and now I'm there, whatever the there is. Now I've become the perfect person. No. Think of ritual as a lifetime work in which you are trying to become something beyond what you are currently imagining. As long as you're thinking of it that way, in other words, not thinking of it in terms of a stable identity, then again, from a Confucian perspective, they would have no problem with that. Yes, rituals are meaningful. Yes, rituals can help define our identity. Just don't let that definition be too easy or that identity be too stable. View it as a lifelong process of work and breaking from standard patterns.
Great, thank you. So we're at the end of our time. I'm going to just ask each of you, what would be the one thing you would hope that students would take away from you tonight, this evening, and what action would you sort of suggest that they take in the near future?
Okay. Wow, that was fast. Let me tell you what happened last week. My daughter, who lives in San Francisco, was driving to our home in South Bay, and she had car trouble. So her car started bellowing smoke, and she had to pull over. It was pretty bad. She had to get it towed. And when we got it to the garage, the news wasn't very good. It was either a broken head gasket or a cracked engine. We weren't sure what, but none of the options looked very good. And so she happened to be moving that weekend, so we said, let's just wait and see if we can get a better quote than what this auto mechanic is giving us. That weekend, I got a text from her, and there was an attachment to it. It was a photo. It was a photo of a very crumpled up receipt. It was a receipt for insurance coverage for this car. We bought this car secondhand 3.5 years ago, and when you read the fine print, it says it covers 4 years and 45,000 miles from the time of purchase. And when we look at it, it was under 4 years, and we're a couple thousand miles under 45. So I emailed her back and I said, this piece of evidence kind of changes the equation. What I would tell you is that 2,000 years ago, something very important happened. If it's not true, then I would be happy to give up my faith. If it's true, it changes what we can hope for as humankind. and how we look at reality. And I would encourage you to look very carefully at this old piece of evidence, because you may be covered, and maybe your options are better than you think. All right.
Michael, how are you going to top that?
Can't top it. Definitely cannot top it. But actually, we'll say something directly related, actually. You will find in practice that people like to think it's a stable world. That, again, if you look within and find your true self, you'll find basically what you are. It's basically a stable world out there in which there are very clear career options and very clear paths to success in any of these career options. And if you accurately look within, and for those students, if you spend your 4 years finding your true self, finding your strengths and weaknesses, and plotting out where your best career option would be given who you are, and then plotting out a very good plan as to how to get there, implicitly you're going to be told that's how the world operates. You're stable, the world is stable, our society is stable, the career goals are stable. Follow this, you'll become successful. And of course, if you're successful, then you can also ask big questions down the road after you retire and after you make your billions, but it's a stable world. What I would ask you is something very simple. Assume that all of that is not the case. Assume that what you really are is a very complex creature with very, very messy emotions and dispositions and faculties and very conflicting values. Assume that the world out there is a very, very messy world. And assume that if you plot out a very clear path for yourself, assuming that stable world, you're very unlikely, I'm sorry to say, to lead a very happy life, because you're going to find that what you currently are now either will not be what you'll be 20 years from now, or much worse, it will be. And you'll find that perhaps what you are now is not what you could have become. So, my challenge to you is very simple. Assume none of that's the case. And assume, on the contrary, that you have the potentials to be something you could not imagine. And assume that the world out there is not a stable one, but it's a malleable one that you can help to create into something much better. And to develop these 4 years, devote yourself to exploring these different sides of yourself in practice, by which I mean, in a Confucian sense, breaking from these standard patterns you're finding yourself in, not assuming I just am X, but if you see I am X, try to break from it and explore and grow. And assume that the world out there is something you will help to create through your actual actions at a very local basis, your immediate community, and at a larger basis through your lifetime of work to build a better society. If you assume that, what you will do is put yourself on a path in which you will become something beyond what you could imagine. You can help to create a world beyond what you could now imagine, and you will actively be a part of creating that better world. In short, what I'd say is, assume that what perhaps you're implicitly hearing from societal values is all wrong. Take a radically different approach. Challenge yourself to live your life fully, trying to break from these standard patterns. And if you do so, I have no idea what you'll become 30, 40 years from now. I have no idea what society you will help to create, but I absolutely can guarantee it will be something far beyond what you could imagine, far greater than you can imagine, and you will leave a life to your children and your grandchildren far beyond anything that would otherwise be imaginable. Thank you.
Wow. So I hope that you found this evening, as I have, which is leaving inspired and also questioning. Our discussants are both people who have thought deeply about fundamental and ultimate questions. Questions that really, I think, go to the heart of the topic of the American dream. How ought we to live? How ought we to live in relation to others? And what role do our spiritual moral traditions play in the present day, and do they have relevance for the present day? I want to just leave with a quote. It's by John Gardner, because I think ultimately this discussion is also about the notion of meaning, and how do we begin to make meaning out of our time here. And John Gardner was a professor at Stanford. So he said, meaning is not something you stumble across, like the answer to a riddle or the prize in a treasure hunt. Meaning is something you build into your life. You build it out of your own past, out of your affections and loyalties, out of the experience of humankind as it is passed on to you, out of your own talent and understanding, out of the things you believe in, out of the things and people you love, out of the values for which you are willing to sacrifice something. If you live your life that way, then it is a meaning in which the traditional definitions of success matter less, and the ones that you construct for yourself matter more. And I think any students who are lucky enough to have both of you are enjoying that possibility of beginning to construct meaning out of their own lives. So thank you, thank our discussants, and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.